This is our speaker, Kenny from Buffalo. He said not to give him a long introduction, so I won't. It's published widely in computational social science journals and conferences, studies people, inequity, all kinds of things. Yeah, great. You have the floor. Go for it.
I can't do the formal introduction. No.
Hi,
Okay, so fancy talk title. Please stop me. I think this is small enough. We can be informal. I don't need to get through all these slides. And the goal here is to get feedback from folks. It's really nice to be here with this group to chat through some of these things. So fancy talk title, less fancy on what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about two projects we have on measurement using computational methods, although as you'll see, there's not a whole bunch of computation here in these two projects. It's more alluding to the types of things we might do with tools. So kind of starting from the ground and building up to like, what are we actually measuring when we start to build fancier, more complex models, okay? So I'm going to talk about measuring attitudes using Twitter data and how that compares to attitudes measuring using survey data. And then we'll talk about how we can use Twitter bios to measure social identity. If there's time, which I think there hopefully will be, at least to seed some discussion, I'm going to talk about the stuff that many of us are thinking about, LLMs, and the end of some of our favorite APIs. Although I did see someone say that Autometer was working again today, which was, I don't know, maybe correlation is not causation, but like I came here from, I've worked on Twitter together a long time. And so, maybe we did that, which is nice of us. Okay. Another thing I'm going to talk about, I think though it's worth it to talk about in the first is why do we do measurement? This kind of discussion of this stems from a lot of discussions and a lot of questions I get from students, right? So why don't you just build stuff to do stuff? I think that's valuable, right? It's super important to be able to build stuff to do stuff. I think about that too, but like, this is really build stuff to quantify stuff. And there's a question of like, okay, well, why would we want to do that? Right? I think this audience has some sense, but I think it's worth it to note this and to think about sort of where the limitations of measurement come from. Right? So the sort of kitschy way I say this, we measure to know and to show, right? So we measure to know how big a problem is, right? From an experimental standpoint, we want to be able to measure whether or not the thing we did has any impact. Right? So how big was the blizzard that hit Buffalo? We tried a novel way of measuring this. My kid hopped up on a snowbank, heavy construction equipment cleared it out in December. And roughly it was like the height of a stop sign minus the height of my 4-year-old, now 5-year-old. And I didn't think about this when I was making the slide, but I don't know if anyone else has seen this class of memes where like Americans will use anything for measurement except the metric system. And I did that without thinking. I'm a stereotypical American. Okay, so we measure to know, we measure to show, right? So not only do I want to ask these questions, I want to be able to tell you, right? Like here's how big the problem is, right? Or here, look, this problem affects all of us. Or here, Buffalo gets a stereotype for being snowy, but like it was 14 degrees warmer on Wednesday when I made these slides, right? And I show this also to emphasize that like Buffalo's stereotype is fair in December, but ICWSM is in Buffalo in June, not December, next year. I tried to get DALL-E to make me a logo. Still some work to do on logo generation with DALL-E, I guess. But if folks are interested in hearing more about working together to build that, I'm happy to chat with folks after this. Okay. So measurement's important. Measurement is hard, right? So either intentionally or unintentionally, if we do bad measurement or sketchy measurement, we can misrepresent the truth, right? Even if we're not actively trying to misrepresent, we can at least disagree, right? So this is from a PNAS paper that I'm sure a lot of you know about. Same survey data, same hypothesis, 73 teams, 25% of those teams found a negative relationship between immigration and support for government provision of services and social government provision of social services, and 16% found a positive relationship, right? So measurement is challenging in all of these ways, and even if it works out and we all agree, I think there's pretty clear evidence that like measurement can't solve all the problems, right? Go ahead, Amelia.
What distinction do you make out of the previous example between modeling and measurement, right? I mean, one could argue that this is just modeling is hard, right? As opposed to measurement is hard. What's the distinction in your nomenclature?
Sure, I would say modeling is a component of a measurement. So I would say we have a construct that we want to measure, we need some data, and then we need to produce a model that leverages the data to evaluate the construct. But I would agree, this is probably more the more concise or narrow way of saying this, that modeling is hard. Okay, so these things, measurement's hard, but measurement's important, and so we plod along, right? This is an AI seminar, so I'm going to talk also more specifically, at least about computation. I think a lot of this tends towards AI machine learning as well. There's a bunch of ways that measurement can help us. Computational methods can help us do measurement. So I think the sort of obvious one, I think many of these are obvious, right? But they're again worth repeating. They can correct bias in our measures. So this is the Gelman Xbox paper, right? So we can use something like multiple regression with post stratification to correct biased survey data. Computational methods can help us dig deeper, right? So we can not just ask questions about like, do you do X, right? So we have a very coarse measure in a survey. We can dig deeper into data and look at, for example, attitudes on specific topics, right? The asterisk that I had in this slide for dig deeper is that I think we can use computational methods to dig deeper than something like survey data, but I still believe that really to sort of narrow down even further, we need to go out and read and look and do qualitative work on our data. Again, this is a snow, I'm going all in on the snow metaphor, I guess. I didn't realize that, but quantitative work I see as like the big snowblower, right? So you're clearing out most of the work, you're getting a sense of the problem, and then you're going around the edges and finding the interesting corner cases with qualitative work. Okay. Computational methods can help us, once we have a measurement, to expound on the impacts, right? So we can take measures of causal effects, throw them into a simulation model, for example, and look at what happens when we have those measurements and we project forward into the world. And the two that I'm going to focus on today are that computational methods can help us create new avenues for measurement, right? So we can take some old ways of doing things, compare with some new ways of doing things using computational methods, and see what the strengths and weaknesses of the two approaches are. And also it does open up just new ways to measure things that are really hard to measure. So those are the two that I'm going to focus on today in these two different projects. Okay, so this first one again is looking at attitudes as measured on social media, and then linking that to attitudes that we can measure on surveys and seeing how they compare. This is joint work with folks at Northeastern. Sarah Sugar is now at NYU. Ryan Gallagher is also not at Northeastern. So people who were at Northeastern. David Lazar is still at Northeastern. Sarah Sugar, Ryan Gallagher, John Green, Alex Matha, and CJ Anon, who's a student at UB. Okay, so surveys are the way we've looked at public opinion for a very long time. Right? You go out, you ask some people, what do you think of X? You find out what they think of X, you plot it. Okay. People in this room, I think, are pretty familiar with the idea that we can do something similar using social media data. Right? So the intuition in some of this work, I think at least the early work, is that we can maybe replace surveys with social media data. I think we sort of have moved past that idea of replacement. But what we really wanted to look at is at the individual level, how do these two things compare? So is it true that we can sort of get a proxy of survey attitudes using someone's tweets? So what we're going to do is we're going to ask some people questions on a survey. We're going to look at those same people and what they tweeted and say, do those two things line up, right? So intuitively, they should. It's the same person, the same opinions. Oh, sorry, the same person in just sort of two different mediums, right? Okay. So how are we going to do that? We're going to use data from the COVID States project. This is a very large survey project that happened during COVID. And actually just ended, I think, a couple months ago. The key for our project is they got asked a bunch of questions about how they feel about a whole bunch of things, many of which were COVID related. But we also asked them, or sorry, COVID States also asked them to share their Twitter handle. Okay, so for some subset of these survey respondents, we have their survey responses in their Twitter handle, and then we collected their tweets, right? And then we're going to focus on 4 different targets of stance, so attitude targets: lockdowns, masks, Trump, and vaccines. These are very coarse, right? And so, as you might imagine, some of the challenge here is operationalization, right? So the way that we did it for social media is we just had a bunch of validated keyword lists that we used for each of these. We pulled tweets from people on those topics, and then just by hand, ourselves, as opposed to farming this out, by hand, we annotated these tweets for states. Right? So why do we do that? Not a model, because a model introduces yet another layer of error that we'd have to try to figure out. So this is, we're pretty sure, like, what these tweets imply. Okay.
Are you assuming that the surveys are the ground truth in a way?
What's that?
Are you assuming that the surveys are
That's
ground
a
truth
good
in a way?
question. No, I think that that's, so I think that that is one way we could think about it. And I would say at the start of the project, that was probably how I thought about it. I think that's maybe not the right way. I think that, so I'll get to this in a couple of slides, but I think that that's, this project and some of the other work that I've seen while doing this project has changed my perspective on that, I think. So one reason here is that it's hard to come up with these sort of course level attitudes from survey data, right? So for Trump, it's not so hard, right? There's a, did you vote for Trump? Or like, are you planning on voting for Trump? But lockdowns, on this survey, there were like 7 or 8 questions regarding different facets of lockdowns, right? And so to actually come up with a single course measure of like, are you pro or anti-lockdown, caused some problems that I think are super interesting, that I'll talk about in a second, right? But again, we sort of, the goal was to compare these two apples to apples. So we're creating a single pro, neutral, anti measure from the survey on these 4 topics, then a single pro, neutral, anti, sort of the standard stance classification task from social media annotations. Okay. Okay, so we have a survey measure for people. We have a social media stance measure for people. Let's play a little game. In the cases where survey respondents gave a neutral response, what % of them do you think tweeted something neutral? Okay.
Small.
Small. Okay, why? Okay, cool. Other guesses? Any other guesses for that one?
All right, fine, because I don't think social media tends to amplify people's rhetoric, and it's not very nuanced. So I assume that neutrality is in itself somewhat of a kind of a milquetoast, kind of in the middle, more nuanced thing, as opposed to Twitter, which is going to be amplifying an extreme.
Okay, great.
Is this conditional upon the fact that they have tweeted about that topic?
Yes. Yes, that's a good.
And I would assume that the vast majority who express something on social, who have responded to these things, did not actually talk about those things on social media.
Yes, that's correct. So just to amplify what Emilio said, the vast majority of people who responded to the surveys did not tweet about these topics. For Trump, it was not a vast majority. I would say it was closer to 35%. But okay, of respondents who gave a pro-Trump survey response, what % tweeted content that was pro-Biden? 0. Okay, cool. 5%. And then the other way around, I would assume people think 0, right? Okay, so the guesses here were all 0. Here are the numbers. This one, I think, gets at both what both of you said, right? Like, no one just goes out and tweets I don't have an opinion on X yet, right? Like that's not what these mediums are for. And so we see virtually none of that. There was a pretty substantial, sorry, so these are the flip numbers. I forgot to fix this. So 30% of people who gave a pro-Trump survey response tweeted something pro-Biden, right? So what's the intuition here? I think, I can't prove this, but I think that people are way more comfortable telling a anonymous survey issuer that they are pro-Trump than they are putting that content on Twitter. There's another big reason, which I'll talk about in a second, that we think that this happened, but 30% and then like virtually none, right? 1 in 10. I think, there's enough noise here where like 1 in 10, I think it could reasonably be 0. I think the actual number is like 93% of people who tweeted pro-Biden did not tweet.
So Ken, yes, this is among people who were pro-Biden in the survey and also tweeted.
Yes,
Okay.
correct. Yes, so this is, go ahead.
And just for clarification, when you say tweet, you mean any kind of tweet? What if they quoted or retweeted something just to, endorse that just to argue back? Would you, sort of filter them out?
So we did not, the only thing we did was look at individual tweets.
So original content, original.
No. We did look at quotes and retweets. Sorry, I didn't quite understand. But yeah, so this could be any kind of tweet, but
if you, let's say, quote an article and you say, oh, what a pile of bullshit, whatever, and then that is still counted towards supporting, even if it's stating an opposing.
No, so that would be opposition. Like if you quote and you say,
okay, so
this person who supports
the annotation is done
you're
on
gonna
the
be
quote.
Right, yes, exactly. Okay, so the summary here, we talked a little bit more about this in the paper, but like the correlation between these differs based on which task you're doing. The correlations for, I'm not gonna get into the actual numbers, but like it was across the board much harder for lockdowns. Why? Because lockdown is a very weird topic and also something that people have like vastly different opinions depending on what we're talking about, right? So like, for example, a lot of people, myself included, struggled with the fact that school was closed for like a year, right? And so like, did I support that school was closed to prevent the spread of COVID? Absolutely. Did I also struggle in many, many ways because I had my 2-year-old home with me for a year? Also, yes, right? And so like, the sort of punchline that I'll come back to a couple of times is like, stance detection might be too coarse for some topics. So we should be careful about what topic we're thinking about, or at least how we sort of subset within it, right? Whereas Trump like was pretty straightforward with the caveat that Twitter is a left-leaning platform and people may, so we have to also consider the context, right? So like anti-Trump was much easier to identify than pro-Trump, right? And neutral was just hard across the board. Question?
Yeah, so in the previous slide, you said the people were okay talking about their stance because they were anonymous, but I thought you were actually tracking the person. The person said it's not anonymous, right? So
no, but in their head, they're talking to someone they don't know, right? So they are just filling out a survey form. So John Green, who's one of the authors on this paper, has what I think is a really nice framing of surveys and social media as like a conversation. Surveys, I guess this is focus, is like a conversation between the person giving the survey and the respondent, right? So like the idea here though is that like the surveyor, in many cases, the goal is to like remove them from the situation, right? So like your hope in your survey is that the person who's responding doesn't think about you as a survey person giving the survey, right? But maybe we can't get rid of all of that, right? So like someone gets a survey from USC, they might be triggered to think about like, well, I don't want those, people getting my data. Hopefully that doesn't happen all the time. So yes, hopefully people are more comfortable.
So I guess this goes in the general direction of whether there was an incentive for the respondents to be truthful or not, right?
Yeah. I think that's part of this, right? So getting back to your question about like our surveys ground truth, like no, surveys are surveys. So we should think about these two approaches, not necessarily as like one is ground truth, one is not, but like two complementary ways of understanding public opinion.
So I probably misunderstood something, but in the graph on the top right,
Yes.
so that's the accuracy of your
Yeah, these numbers.
So what is how do you interpret this? That you have like
Right.
I don't know, 60% accuracy on predicting somebody's pro-Trump? Is that the way to read this, or
Yeah, so these graphs are very hard because doing something like precision and recall requires that you assume a ground truth, right? So like in these graphs, again, we treat, I think, 100% of all surveys. Yeah, so surveys are ground truth here. So in the case of vaccines, 40% of the people who provided an anti-vax response in the survey were anti-vax in the Twitter data. So why, right?
Yeah.
I think for vaccines, so I think a lot of this variance, now we're shifting to a more speculative. I have some empirical evidence, but I think I can only say so much with this data. We kind of came up with a couple of reasons. I think the most important one was time, right? So like, this is when the vaccine tweets happened. This is when the surveys happened, right? And so what part of this is the fact that people were being asked about vaccines when there were real questions about the effectiveness of the vaccines, and when we didn't know much about the ramifications of taking the vaccine. People were tweeting about the vaccines once we knew all that, right? And so like, it's distinctly possible that like the fact that we ask surveys at a very different time when we think public opinion is forming, whereas people tweet once they form their opinion, cause some of this, right? But if that were the case, then we would expect that if we ask people in the survey at this point and then ask them at this point, which we have for some people, those responses would change at a similar rate to if we asked the survey at this time and we saw a tweet at this time, right? And that doesn't happen. So survey responses over time are way more consistent than comparing survey responses to Twitter responses at those same times. So time is some of it, but it's not all of it. And so what is it? I don't really know. I think we're pretty confident that our annotations are right. We did them ourselves. We have a whole thing about like points at which we were more and less confident about our annotations. And even when you subset to only annotations that we were pretty confident about, this still holds. Go ahead, Amin.
I mean, if I understood it, this would hint at the fact that people essentially don't change opinion. And we know this from political science and so on, as you know better than I do, right? So simply, once the opinion is formed, it has a tendency to be unchanged in the, despite evidence of contrary or whatever, right? Or despite time passing.
Yeah. So I think that that's right. So I think that that's probably closer to my view, is that there's pretty stable opinions on a lot of things, and just like where we're looking for that opinion has a very significant impact on what we're going to see, right? And so these two things are different ways of measuring public opinion. We should always keep in mind that they are different. One is not necessarily better than the other. I very much believe that, but they're different. Right? And using both of them gives us a more complete picture of like what people are willing to say publicly versus like what people are willing to say on surveys. And again, those are just two different constructs. I do think though that Twitter's a bad place. I don't think anyone would necessarily argue here, if only because it's just hard to measure change on Twitter. People only tweet once about things for the most part, right? So like, if only for that, it's a tough place to measure change in attitude. But I also think, so I think that's the main thing, right? Like people tweet when they make up their minds about stuff. And so if you're going to look at, once someone's made up their mind enough to tweet about it, I think the odds of them changing their mind is pretty low. But you get to see a whole bunch of people making up their minds at once. And so it's good for what I forget the site here, someone who I can give a reference to, it calls a meso level, right? So like different groups of people, we have enough data where we can say something about subpopulations, whereas that's really hard in surveys. Okay, and then we already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into it. Like we have to be careful about the types of constructs we're trying to measure with stands. So lockdowns being a good example of something that's pretty tough. Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna spend a little bit of time, I'll kind of rush a bit more through this, but I think this other category of work is focusing on something that we've been trying to measure for a really long time, identity, but something that's kind of difficult to measure, right? So when I say identity, sorry, I should just call it, this is work with students at University of Buffalo, Naveed Madani and graduated students there, and then Michael Yoder at CMU and Brian Swire Thompson at Northeastern. Identities, when I say that, I mean the words and phrases we use to label other people that have some culturally shared meaning, right? Doesn't have to be shared across all of us, but like it has to have, it can't just be like a phrase that I apply to myself and no one else knows what that means, right? So it's not these one-off things, and there's sort of interesting reasons why I think that latter part is important, but these are the things we use to label ourselves, where when I say them, you know what I mean, okay? When I say a father of two, you infer some perceptions of me, right? I also just love this picture because like, he is so mad that he has to put his arm around his brother. And this one is so mad that he is getting touched by his brother. This is our Christmas at home in the snowstorm. And then my kid saw it and said, the dog is also your child. So I'm a father of three, right? Okay, so this is an identity. These things are important because they shape behavior, right? So when I am up here enacting the identity of like presenter, I'm behaving in a certain way. When I'm at home, I'm enacting a different way. And that's because I've taken on a particular identity, right? And so we can ask like all sorts of interesting questions about these things. What are all of the identities that exist? How are they distributed across society, right? And how does that link to social inequality? What do identities mean? When I say father of two, what do you think of, right? And then in turn, how does that make you behave? Okay. The problem is these things are really hard because I never just like walk in the door at home from work and just like proclaim to the world in a way that's captured by any sort of tool we have that I am now going to enact the identity father of two. So I don't do that except when I do. And I do this on social media, right? So again, there are caveats here because I'm doing this in a very particular way, right? I'm self-presenting in sort of like a professional setting for me, for us. And so I'm pretty careful about what I put here. So a lot of this is going to be filtered through that. Let's just keep that in mind as we go through, right? The other interesting thing is that I'm presenting multiple identities. So people tend to only enact one identity at a time. But here I'm telling you all of them. So we can look at like interesting correlations among them. Okay. So this gives us a chance to think about, right, not only identity, but also how it's associated with different behaviors, right? So like I tweet things as a dad, I tweet things as a researcher, okay? The catch is that these aren't all actually identities, right? So like this is in the standard social psych definition of identity is like, this is an identity. She is the US representative of New York, the 14th congressional district in New York. This is not, this is a signal of an identity, right? This is not a word or phrase that I use to label myself, right? This is like, it signals some implicit identity, okay? And so a lot of this work is really just about how do we link this back to social psych theories of what identity is in a way that's like, that we can speak to social scientists, right? And so ultimately what we do is we throw up our hands and say, these aren't identities, but they're still interesting. We're gonna define this new concept that we call personal identifier. We're going to construct a very, very simple way to extract these out from bios, which is just a regex. And then we're going to do a whole bunch of evaluation. Okay, so this is, we did that. I'm sorry, I'm trying to decide how much you I'm going to stay pretty surface level. I'm happy to dig in more at the end. But again, the general idea is like identities were too hard, but it was much easier to think about phrases that signal identity, Okay, and so the way we did this is we did a whole bunch of qualitative work where we just looked at phrases that we chopped up with regular expressions. We fixed the regular expressions, we looked at the phrases again, we came up with a code, a definition of these personal identifiers, and then a regular expression that we could use to chop bios up in ways that got most of these personal identifiers. Okay, so here's just like examples of this regular expression. It's fine, right? It does most of the trick, but you can see, like, for example, like it treats that period as like a split when it really shouldn't. And like he, him, you could argue is like a single identity, right? But it's good enough. Right? So it's a good starting point for some of these things, right? Also, like this is not like a way that we characterize identity. We would hope that like we had a method that got rid of these. Okay. So that's like the wishy-washy way of saying it kind of works. We do a bunch of more formal stuff to say it kind of works. You know, at some point I would love if someone came along and built a tool that could do this better than a regular expression. But this is like good enough, I think, to study behavior, maybe with some post hoc cleaning. Okay. So we show this doing some various sort of standard annotation tasks, right? And then we look at, so this is using data linked to voter registration records. So we can look at like, what are the most common phrases for people who are older? There's some validity here, right? Like those are old people things. These are young people things. We looked at status. I think it was like ratio of followers to followees, right? I'm like high status professor, high status versus lower status on Twitter, right? I think this is kind of interesting because these point at just like people who tend to do way more following than be followed. These are sort of more like popular culture things. So it also tells us maybe a little bit about Twitter and how it works.
So how do you find status? Like people have followed or not followed?
It's a ratio of
I mean, it's just sad, like somebody who is very caring, they will as low status.
Yeah. So this is status on Twitter, right? So this is
it's like a number of followers.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Ratio of how many people are following you to how many people you follow.
Okay, so maybe it's popularity or something like that. Status seems a bit
hard. Cool. So in any case, we have a bunch of other charts like this in the paper, but like it checks out. It can give us some details about how people, how demographics relate to identities. Okay. And so we can do some interesting things. Again, like these stars represent the fact that like I'm answering these questions on Twitter. And we have to think about all the biases that exist when I do something through a sort of that mediated format. But like we can start to get at some of these questions, right? I would argue though that these two questions are probably more interesting, right? So like, what are the meanings that we attach to these identities? And then how does that meaning that we infer shape behavior? And so the second part of our work in this space has been starting to look at these questions. So again, returning to like standard social psych approaches to characterizing meaning, these scales, right? So you ask survey respondents again, like where does father of three line up on partisanship, right? And so we show in our work that we can kind of correlate pretty well with these surveys, right? Again, and sorry. So the other thing we can do is we can use a bunch of these dimensions and then like project down and find some interesting structure in these identities, right? So surveys are great for this task, but they're also really expensive and hard to do at scale. Whereas like, obviously we can look at some of these things at scale pretty easily with these kinds of just embedding approaches that we develop, right? We can also do this with whole bios. This is, I think, maybe a more dramatic change from what we can do in social psych right now, which is like we have no idea in social psych, at least as far as I'm aware, of how to think about composition of identities and how compositions of identities are perceived, right? So like, it's obvious here where you would put this one on a partisan scale, but there's other examples, right, where like maybe age is implied by some identities and other ages are implied by other identities. And we don't really know how to think about how people compose a bunch of identities into a perception of a person. Okay. So we've started to look at that. Again, we ran these kinds of surveys. We showed our method at least lines up pretty well with how people respond in surveys. And then what we did was link that to the sharing of low quality news on Twitter. So we took a bunch of, go ahead, Amelia.
Do you have only political leaning as the dimension that you're measuring, or a bunch of other things?
A bunch. So this is one other, well, not a bunch actually. We only did 4: age, partisanship, gender, and because we were looking at misinformation, we did religiosity. Those are the only 4 that we've worked on so far. So we replicate the standard, like older people on the right share misinformation using this tool. The sort of 2 interesting pieces are, one, we have enough data to look at the interaction effect. So it's not just that there's not an additive effect of age and being on the right. It's you're old and you're on the right and it skyrockets, right? The other caveat here is we're not actually trying to characterize you, and this is important. We're not actually saying that these people are older and right-leaning, right? I don't know what their demographics are. I don't even know if they're a person. In fact, many of them probably aren't, but their bios present to other people in such a way that they are older and on the right. And so when we see misinformation, right, the misinformation environment on Twitter is such that much of the misinformation is produced by accounts that we will perceive as this, and that matters. Go ahead.
What are you using to define quality of news sites?
News card, yeah. Right, so I think we can have a long discussion about whether or not yes, this is the piece that I think we wanted to, this is sort of what we were really interested in. I think we want to show that it's useful, and so we're trying to use sort of a standard approach. I would love to chat about like whether or not we think that there are better ways at this point to discuss, to identify misinformation online. But yeah.
I was just trying to kind of.
Yeah, totally fair. Go ahead.
For surveying age, is it also like a 5-point scale where the middle is equally likely? Or how did you do that?
No, so that's a good question. We did it just like basically give me the number.
Okay.
And so actually, we probably should have been better about that. We were stealing from a prior work that we had that used the number, I think, but that was for like identities that spanned the age range. So we had like baby and child in that data set. For this, it probably would have been better to go with something like this. So actually the standard deviation of age was like pretty constrained. So it's a good question. Okay, so I mean, I went to get a picture of Hot Topic, and I saw that Hot Topic. I don't know if other people know the store Hot Topic, but it's still around, and apparently it's doing better than it was when I was a kid, which is pretty interesting. It's a fun store to go into. Okay, so just briefly, hopefully to seed discussion. I don't claim to have any answers here. So this is just a reminder, right? When we study expressions on social media, whether it's identity or attitude, we're studying it in context, and we're studying it as the way people are presenting themselves. And sometimes we don't know what the context is, right? So temporally, for example, there are things going on in the world, in people's lives, etc. So like we have some unknowns there, and it's always worth thinking about that. Okay, the more I think interesting thing, what do we do now that there's no Twitter API, there's no Reddit API, or at least I can afford those things. I think one thing to do is think about like what social media is going to look like now. Like it's not crazy that social media sites die. Most of them do at some point. So what is it going to look like? I think Yini Zhang is a researcher at UB as well. Her view is like it's going to just evolve into a whole bunch of niche sites. I think that's a really interesting perspective. So just a prompt for her work in that space. But I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that. Do we start to like look elsewhere, right? And like, one of the places we might start to look is in these conversations with these large language models. I think these models are obviously a cause of of why we don't have APIs anymore, at least certain APIs. But it's interesting to think about whether or not they are, yes, they can help us do some things methodologically. I think they're crazy powerful in various ways. And so for computational social science, it's sort of a double-edged sword where, like, you know, my understanding of the state of the art right now is it's worse than a fine-tuned model, but not by much. So that's great. But on the flip side, we lose APIs, I think, in large part because of them. And also maybe we have to shift to start asking, like, is it the case that in 5 years, we're going to be looking at measures of opinion based on like these scraped chats from ChatGPT? That's kind of scary. And then is it the case that we're going to have to think about how ChatGPT shapes public opinion? And so I think these are like kind of interesting things to chat about with you all. Cool. So that's it. Thank you.
Questions? I guess, Peter, can we open up for questions? Awesome. Question?
No, I can ask a question. Because also you did this about identity, but I didn't see a slide on what are the identities that you found. I mean, you said, okay, I got 70% of them, 75% are correct, but so what are these identities that are popular or common, or was that clustering or?
Right. So a lot of the yeah. So we did some clustering. I think I can show that. Did I delete that slide? I did. Bummer.
I mean, that seems interesting. And people have probably multiple identities, but I don't.
Correct. So most of the identities that we looked at were, so the most popular by far were gender pronouns. We looked in 2020. I would say like 6% of all profiles we looked at across a bunch of different data sets had gender pronouns. That's heavily on the left. That might not surprise you. And then political identities were pretty popular as well. We did some clustering. I think that the interesting thing that's popped out to me, I don't have like a super formal way of expressing this yet, but like I've seen this in a bunch of data sets on these bios now, where like Twitter is split between like people who want to talk about politics and people who want to talk about like culture. And you see that in the bios where like we have a cluster of like identities about like, I think it's yoga and like foodie culture, right? Which like, I say that to you, you're like, yeah, obviously, right? But like, if we think about like semantically, yoga and food are like pretty far apart, right? So clustering these identities based on the extent to which they're co-occur within a person is a very different way in social psych, I think, to think about how identities overlap, right? So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of where we're at with it. I don't have I can pull up.
Well, I mean, it's like we're interested to see what kind of, so people have multiple identities. And I mean, actually your labels, I find them funny. I mean, like white Asian, that doesn't seem to be the right labels. Right?
Well, right. So that's part of what we're trying to say with this, right? So discriminant validity is what is the extent to which your measure measures something different than some other measure? So this is from the voter registration record, right? So we take how these people are labeled in the voter records. They're either labeled, their race is labeled as white or their race is labeled as Asian. And we say, what are the identities that show up in bios? This is like a log odds. So Oahu, the log odds of showing up in the profile of someone who is in the voter record labeled as Asian versus white, it's like 4x.
That associates, yeah, for people who self-describe as Asian, which kind of these identities that you identify, or this construct that you call identities, how they associate with them. So somebody born of Oahu maybe is like a Japanese, Hawaiian, identifies as Asian. I mean, so identifies as Oahu, but is probably Japanese, Hawaiian, and then is Asian in the census record.
Correct, but I would argue that these are way more nuanced than this, right? So like when we start to think about like, let's correlate demographics with misinformation sharing, if we can say actually in a more narrow sense that like, you know, it's the people who label themselves as Christian rather than the white people who share this, right? So like that's what we're looking at as well, right? Like there's theories that the religious right and not just the right are the people who share the most misinformation, right? And so like identity is a more narrow category than demographics, right? So within a demographic, we have, as you're saying, right, a bunch of different sort of subcategories that we could use. Looking at those more specific subcategories, I think gives us a more nuanced way to think about behavior.
I don't know. I don't know how we have time or not. Oh, you have time. So, I mean, it would be interesting if you have showed. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I know that 40% or half of the UC Berkeley population is Asian students, which makes sense, I guess.
Not quite. So this is the odds of someone who is labeled as Asian in the demographics versus the odds of someone that's white. So this is just like you're 2x more likely if you have Cal in your bio to be labeled as Asian.
But anyway, what I wanted to say is like it would be interesting if you showed relationships between the values in the y-axis, which are these identities in some kind of generic sense, with other properties. I mean, so have you done more of this type of analysis other than this white Asian or the more? No. So I'm like, what do people that describe themselves at UC Berkeley? What else do they think about? I mean, or people who there are like things like very generic, like mother or father, and they all like conservative Christians.
You mean expressed on social media? So the identity is correlated to their ideology or topics or interest or whatever that is expressed on social media.
Yeah, but what?
Not as a function of the demographic or the
but what?
Quote unquote.
Right. What do you see that? I mean, like people who describe at UC Berkeley, what do they talk about in social media?
Right. So something like this, right? So like professors tend to talk about papers. Parents used to generally talk about. I would love to do that, but like where we've been stuck for a while and now are sort of unstuck, I think finally is like, how do you extract out, like, what are the meaningful things that you extract out here? So like one easy thing, right? Is it the case that we should be looking at is it useful to say that I am just a professor in CS, right? Do I have this identity or do I really have to consider all of that, right? Or like just professor. Is it useful to talk about what just professors talk about versus professors of anthropology versus professors of computer science? Defining the unit of analysis when we talk about bios and like subphrases within them is really hard.
So my suggestion now would be it's a hierarchical thing. So
yes.
You're a professor, but not any kind of professor. You're a particular kind of professor, an assistant professor, which is a particular type of professor.
But
and then I mean, and this kind of you do it in a multidimensional way. I mean, it's different. I mean, professor in CS, professor in anthropology, or at Buffalo versus Berkeley, or
yes, but there's two hierarchies here, right? So one of the hierarchies. So yes, I totally agree. This is a yes and. Which is there's the hierarchy like semantically, so professor of anthropology, professor of computer science, and then there's the hierarchy that you can construct by looking at identities that tend to be shared within bios, right? So like in that case, he, him, and dad end up being together in a hierarchy, right? Whereas semantically they would be in very different hierarchies, structures. So yeah, I agree. I think we're super early in thinking about a lot of this.
Yeah, so usually social media have these two identities. One is for professional profile, and then there's a personal profile. So here you're assuming both of them are together, and that's probably why you have the professor and the dad. How would that vary? Have you considered that? Like if you are looking only at one type of profile, you'll get like a lot of professional tweets as opposed to personal tweets.
I think my answer is we would love to look at that, but we haven't yet. But yeah, like I end up mixing, we should not be looking at so much at my profile. Let's look at AOC. AOC really doesn't mix, I guess. So that kind of kills my, like this is like purely professional. There are obvious reasons why. So like, are we talking about like, yeah, then it gets into like, is this a professional bio? Like kind of, but this is probably more professional. And then like just quantifying a bunch of these things. It's I think, super interesting, but tough. Joe,
this one's from Zoom. So Adam R sends a pointer. I'll forward that to you after the talk. Then there's a question. It says some distinctions are made between intrinsic values versus instrumental values. Is there a similar distinction for identities? Some are more intrinsic and others are more instrumental.
I don't know the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental values, but I will comment with two relevant things that I've been thinking a lot about that I hope line up. So one of them is Lynn Smith-Levin is a social psychologist. She differentiates between weak identities and strong identities. So weak identities are contextual. So presenter is an identity that like I take on right now, but I don't tend to do that. Weak identities are driven by context, whereas strong identities I tend to hold no matter where I am. Right? Partisanship, I think, is a really interesting example because for some people, partisanship is a weak identity on Twitter. You're a partisan on Twitter, but like you don't carry it around with you. Other people, partisanship is strong because it's on Twitter and it's everywhere in your life. It controls everything. And so which of these identities are sort of weak in the sense that I perform them on Twitter but not elsewhere versus strong and carry through elsewhere, I think is a really interesting question. The other thing I think maybe is relevant is like, what are the axes along which we align identities, right? Versus like, what are the actual phrases? So like, there's a lot of left-leaning identities, a lot of right-leaning identities. But partisanship is like a dimension along which we categorize them. And so differentiating between like these dimensions of identity and actual phrases, I think is interesting. Hopefully that was relevant to what Adam is asking. Cool. Go ahead.
Have you looked at how people's identities change or stay consistent across different social media platforms?
I would love to. I have not been able to.
It sounds like a nightmare from a data set perspective, but like.
Yeah, but I think you could do it because a lot of people point to their Instagram hashtags and stuff. But that's been really high. Like here's whatever. I think there's one platform in particular, Meetup, where like you get to present a different identity to different groups. I think Meetup data is like around. So if anyone wants to do that, I would love to read your paper.
I don't know, perhaps in closing, as a big picture question, you can do these things. So what?
Right.
Like, what did we learn? How do we use it? What can we do better than before being able to do this and so on? What's your vision of this in the sort of how this grows into the future?
Right. I mean, that's the R2 comment that we've gotten the first time we
submitted
this paper, right? It was, are you sure? But so this is sort of where I would agree that I'm circling. In social psych, the utility is very clear. Social psychologists want these measurements because they use them then in experiments, for example. So I can like prime a survey respondent, act like a father of three, and we can look at how identity shapes behavior. In the online context, I think it's interesting to look at the types of accounts that end up engaging in certain behavior. So Michael Yoder, a co-author on that paper, looks at how homophily emerges based on shared bioterms. I think thinking about homophily in these really high dimensional spaces, right? So we can move beyond these like couple 4 dimensions and we can project these profiles into whatever 500 dimensions. Like, can we think about homophily in higher dimensions? I think a place where I would like to go next, right? Like, what are the ways, if I had to like project very far into the future, like I'm really interested in what are the fundamental axes along which we categorize other people, and then like how does that produce behavior?
Thinking about behavior, interventions, mitigation strategies, and so on, how do you think that, what are the actionable directions that one can sort of embark upon, thinking about the fact that the vast majority of these dimensions that you're measuring are essentially immutable to a large extent, right? Your political leaning, you can't really change people's political leaning, you can change their gender identity and so on, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's true. So 2 thoughts come to mind there. One is you can change what you present. So is it the case that we can make social media a more palatable place if we just reshape how people are presenting themselves? Because changing how you ask people to present themselves will change their behavior, right? We know that. So even if you still think about yourself as a partisan, we say on this site, we want you to present yourself along the things that you do in everyday life. That's going to fundamentally shift behavior on the platform. I would bet lots of money on that. So like one way of thinking about this is even if we can't change how people behave, maybe we can change the ways in which they present themselves, right? I think the second piece is that there are avenues for this kind of work. I think even if we don't aim to intervene. So one specific example that comes up in some of the other work we've done is like, there's a longstanding discussion, maybe less so now, I think it's more settled, but there was a longstanding discussion, especially in the context of the protests that happened after George Floyd, as to whether or not we should be using the word thug to refer to Black people. Refer to protesters, right? And the debate becomes, should we use the word thug is semantically and denotatively not associated with race, but like in culture, it absolutely is, right? And so part of the goal of some of the earlier work and sort of continuing here is like trying to show that these words have meaning that's not denotative, right? And so when you use words that have cultural meanings associated with both race and being bad and being powerful, like on these affective dimensions, that has real world implications for how downstream we understand Black people, right? And so being able to do those measurements in a convincing way, just coming back to this measurement piece, I think is important, whether or not we aim to intervene ultimately.
One last question, I guess, this time online again from Adam R. Does one more question, given the speed of tech development here, and there's a whole discussion to be had about AI as tools for computational social science, what AI tools does Kenny use to keep up with innovation in AI?
What AI tools do I use to keep up with innovation? I would be curious to hear what other people use. I mean, I'm slowly getting into this space of like the Scholar tool, I forget what they're called. Some of these tools that surface relevant work. I'm still like not trusting enough to use them and still want to dig. But I guess my answer is like probably not enough of them to kind of keep up with the work. Anyone have good ones? The discussion.
One more question. And so I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, how does the thing that you're trying to do compare to like market segmentation? And people like Facebook of the world or Google, they have these extremely detailed profiles of everybody. And in a sense, you're doing some version of that. So
yeah,
I mean, I don't know if you can use similar techniques, or maybe you don't have the data, or you can kind of leverage some of that work. Because I understand that there.
Right. So this is like another kind of discussion that we've had with reviewers on versions of this work, which is like the real ethical questions here. I think at least on the surface, there's real ethical question about whether or not we should be doing this. But I think there's sort of two responses to that. One is Facebook's profile segment, like market segmentation stuff, is way more advanced than this, right? So like, I'm not going to produce a tool with this work that can do market segmentation better than a model that considers, for example, all of the content in a tweet, in a profile, right? I think the second piece is, what was the second piece? That I don't remember what the second piece was. So I'll just say, like, I think that this is really driven by more by like what we can say that lines up with theory about identity and how we can advance theory and understanding of identity, rather than an ability to do market segmentation, because market segmentation is way more solved for them than it will ever be for this kind of tool. I think the one additional piece, and I'll go back there, is the one nice thing here is that I can actually ask some questions using this kind of tool that I couldn't ask if I did something with market segmentation, because market segmentation considers all of this. And so like you're confounded, right? If I ask like in a given market segment, who tweets what, that's confounded because my market segmentation is constructed based on who tweets what. So like trying to separate out this from this is.
So I think they have many dimensions. So market segmentation is not that you are in a single cluster. It's like you have all these dimensions and you can pick pieces to find the group that you want to target. I happen to have a friend that has a company on AstroTurf.
But that's informed by, but that's, I would assume, informed by everything, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to pay Facebook for their profiles, and then you can use their tools to query the individuals that match whatever you're looking for.
Right. So, I mean, another version of this is like, probably we could include the profile picture. So a lot of the demographic inference work takes at least all of this to do some of those inferences. but again, like, that's why I want to be very narrow. Sorry, that was the second thing I was going to say, right? Like, I really want to look at how people present themselves on this. I don't want to say you are this based on this. I have to be very careful because that is not what I'm looking at. I think in some ways it's actually more ethical to try to analyze people as they want to be seen than it is to try to look through someone to get to their demographic. So, maybe we lose some things in that way, but.
In my mind, and this is to perhaps stress the value that is in this particular work that you are doing, it's very different from market segmentation, the way I think of it, right? Because market segmentation is not about really finding identity and so on. There is a lot more. There is, finding subpopulations, understanding how people are vulnerable or susceptible to change in behavior, purchasing behavior, or whatever else, given their, the segments they belong to, given what they're interested in, et cetera, understanding other independent like externalities, like how much money they have, how much money they spend, and so on. Whereas this work, in my mind, is much more like, can we determine whether people respond, let's say, in a consistent way on a offline, survey, and what they say online? How do we measure whether these two things match alongside? And then can we complement these two things to get to some, perhaps down the road to some other answer, like the misinformation stuff that you looked at? It seems relatively different from all that marketing.
Yeah. Appreciate that reformulation. I think you're right. There's similarities and differences, and I don't think I've quite found the correct unpacking of that yet, but that's certainly really helpful in doing so.
All right, it's 12:03. I think we should thank our speaker. Great job.